What is going on, everybody? Welcome to a brand new episode of Taboo Table Talk. I'm your host, Krish Mohan, and these are your pre-show announcements. Hey, I've got the last two shows of the year lined up and ready to go for this weekend. If you're listening to this on the day it comes out or within a couple days that this comes out, I have a virtual show, a Forkful of Noodles recording over Zoom tomorrow, Friday, December 17th at 8 p.m. If you're interested in being in the virtual audience for my Forkful of Noodles live virtual recordings, a mouthful to say there, come hang out with me tomorrow, December 17th at 8 p.m. over Zoom. We're going to be going over the history of China and why there's so much aggression towards that country from the United States and from Western imperial powers. And the last show of 2021 is going to be an in-person show in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So to all my Pittsburgh friends, I hope you can make it out Saturday, December 18th at the Fun House at Mr. Small's. I'm headlining their new stand-up comedy show, which is hosted and produced by my dear friend, very good friend, Zach Funk, who's been on this podcast several times. That's Saturday, December 18th, 8:30 p.m. at the Fun House at Mr. Small's. I hope some of my Pittsburgh friends can come out to this. This is new material that I'm working on. I'm very excited about it. It's growing, it's evolving, and I'm trying to have a little bit more fun with it. So that's going on. The virtual shows, the stand-up comedy virtual show that I had on December 11th is going to be moved to February 3rd, 2022. And the DSA fundraiser is being moved to January 27th, 2022. So you guys have time to get tickets for those shows as well. I kind of had to move those because of the holiday season and low turnout that I am thinking is more related to the fact that people want to go out and do stuff over the weekends, and the fact that it's the holidays as well. So move those shows to a weekday into 2022. All the details and information can be found directly on my website, which is krishmohanhaha.com. KRISHMOHANHAHA.com. So I hope some folks can come out to the virtual show. I hope some folks can come out to the in-person show. It'll be great to meet some folks that listen to the podcast. If it's in the virtual show, type it up in the in the chats. The chat on in Zoom is always open at those virtual shows. And if you come to an in-person show, come by, say hello, let me know that you listen to the podcast. And it'll be a good fun time. So again, go to my website, krishmohanhaha.com, KRISHMOHANHAHA.com. And without any further ado, let's dive into this week's episode. Enjoy it, everybody. All right, everybody. Welcome to a brand new episode of Taboo Table Talk. Before we go on, I do want to say I hope that everything sounds okay. Right before I started recording, I had a little bit of audio trouble with the interface that I've really never dealt with before, where it just kind of disappeared. Like my computer just stopped recognizing it, and then it did, and then it was kind of picking up some other shit. So I'm hoping that everything sounds okay. And you guys can hear the podcast well. That's a little warning there. If it doesn't, if something's goofed up, let me know, and I will try to fix that problem for the future, I guess. But that's the tough part of being an independent content producer, independent content creator, is that I don't really have like an audio engineer to work on these things, like I don't really have somebody on staff that I can be like, hey, this thing is goofed up, what can we do to kind of fix it and improve the audio quality of the podcast so it doesn't sound terrible. So I kind of have to figure out troubleshooting stuff by myself, and a lot of that involves unplugging and replugging things back in, because I know some audio engineering stuff, but I'm not an expert by any means. So hopefully this thing sounds good. But I have a pretty great interview for you guys today. I have a pretty great conversation important conversation that I think needs to be had. A conversation that you know, again, you're not, if you're someone that comes to my podcast uh, after listening to like corporate mainstream media, this is going to subvert everything you hear on corporate mainstream media. You're going to hear people that are you know, on the ground in a lot of these places. You're going to hear street level accounts from countries that you normally hear propaganda from. And this week's conversation is with Ben Norton, who is a independent journalist with the Grayzone. If you guys haven't checked out the Grayzone, I highly recommend you guys go follow the Grayzone. That's GRAY Zone. Go check them out. They've done some incredible work on you know, countering U.S. imperialism and countering the narrative that you hear on corporate mainstream news. And this episode is no different. Ben gets into the history of Nicaragua and how the U.S. has meddled in Nicaragua pretty consistently. And this past year, we saw the victory of Socialist Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, and this kind of became a really big thing. Because over the last couple months, we've been seeing Nicaragua re-enter the corporate mainstream narrative, and there are all these stories coming out in the Grayzone. And Ben's particularly has done a really great job of breaking down what these pieces of propaganda are, where they're getting their information, how they're manipulating the information, and what the real story is, right? And I've always thought that if you're gonna get to the truth, if you're gonna understand what's going on in these countries, why socialism is being demonized the way that it is, so on and so forth, you have to understand the history of these countries. You have to understand how America has meddled and influenced the history of these nations, manufactured the outcome that it would like to manufacture history itself, and that's what we're going to get into with this conversation. So I hope you guys are buckled in, because this is another one of those super informative. And it's got a lot of stuff packed in it. So buckle in, because we're going to take a trip down to Nicaragua and learn all about that history and learn about why this election was so important. So without any further ado, let's dive into this week's episode with Ben Norton from the Grayzone. Enjoy it, everybody. To kind of start off, just so folks and myself, because I'm not fully versed on the history of U.S. interference in Nicaragua, would you be able to kind of go through in brief, or really in whatever detail you would like to, as you know, the extent of U.S. interference in Nicaragua? Because that's one of the countries that I think there has been a lot of, well, most countries, I feel like there's been a lot of U.S. interference, as is the nature of the game. But specifically Nicaragua, how far back does that go, and what is the extent of that interference?
Well, thanks for having me, man. It's good to be here. I'll start by saying that I think when we're talking about U.S. meddling, or just in general U.S. imperialism in Latin America, we have to understand the historical context of classical European colonialism, and the idea that the US was like some unique power that, unlike Britain and France, it didn't have colonies. I mean, that's obviously absurd. We know that Puerto Rico is still a US colony, that Hawaii was a US colony and it became a state. But I mean, the US was created through settler colonialism. The idea that the US was different than British colonialism in some way, I mean, that's just part of American exceptionalism. So if we look at Latin America, I mean, we see very clearly that Mexico, half of Mexico was stolen by the US in a war of aggression in the northern half of Mexico in 1846 to 1848. So when we're talking about Nicaragua, which is right in the heart of Central America, Nicaragua has been targeted by the U.S. empire for well over 100 years. I mean, going back to the 19th century, to the 1800s, and going back really to the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, the U.S. government declares basically that Latin America is its colonial backyard, its sphere of influence. And the Monroe Doctrine was specifically a doctrine declared telling the European colonial powers that Latin America belongs to the U.S. empire. It was specifically a kind of warning to Spain, to Portugal. And then, of course, in 1898, there's the Spanish American War, in which, again, it's called Spanish American, and the other one's called the Mexican American. It's actually, these are U.S. wars. And in the case of the Spanish American War, the U.S. says, oh, hey, Cuba, hey, Puerto Rico, hey, Philippines, we're going to support you in your fight against Spanish colonialism. And then, wink, wink, we're actually going to turn you into our own colonies. So in 1898, Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico became U.S. colonies. So just really briefly, I mean, I think that history is important there because when we're talking about U.S. meddling today or in the past 50 years in Latin America, which we often do, we have to situate it in that historical context of just as France colonized North Africa, just as Britain colonized like a quarter of the planet from South Asia to Southeast Asia to large parts of Africa. I mean, the U.S. did something very similar. The difference is that the U.S. as a nation state was created later on, so it was kind of late to the game of colonialism. But the U.S. was created through a project of settler colonialism, ethnically cleansing the indigenous, and then not just moving westward, but moving southward. Because we know about Manifest Destiny, right? But it also was going southward, not only taking half of Mexico, but there were colonial projects in parts of Latin America. So Nicaragua is a good example of this. In the 1850s, a white American who didn't speak Spanish, who had no links to Latin America, named William Walker, declared himself fake president and then reinstated slavery in the areas he controlled with the help of his mercenaries called the filibusters and tried to take over the country. So the idea of Manifest Destiny, I think, is also something that it doesn't just go west from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. It also goes south into Latin America. So U.S. meddling in Latin America goes back to the 1800s, and Nicaragua has been a target not only because of its geostrategic location in the middle of Central America, but also because many, not just the U.S. government, but many oligarchs, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the robber baron billionaire, well, millionaire in his time, modern day billionaire, they wanted to build a canal. And there were many plans to build a canal through Nicaragua, which they later instead did in Panama, of course, the famous Panama Canal.
So is that just primarily to acquire resources? That was that why this push southward happened? Just so they can have like a better trade route? Is that what it? Because that's what it kind of seems like.
Yeah, well, resources are definitely a part of it, and especially if you look at the history of the so-called banana wars, that is the U.S. corporations like the United Fruit Company, which became Chiquita Bananas, their role, the company's role in supporting so-called civil wars, which are really just like U.S. wars to destabilize countries on behalf of the United Fruit Company and corporate interests, and also the role of United Fruit Company in paying paramilitary groups, death squads to kill labor organizers, to kill striking workers. I mean, of course, we know, anyone who knows about the history of capitalism knows about the very bloody history of corporations hiring scabs and strike breakers and all of that. I mean, they did that definitely in Latin America, and with a special emphasis on food, on agriculture, on bananas, on coffee, on beans, rice. So then there are also, I mean, there are clearly massive natural resources in Venezuela, which has the largest oil reserves in the world. Something that John Bolton said, the Trump's national security advisor, this hardcore neocon war criminal, he did an interview with Fox News and said that the U.S. wants access to Venezuela's oil reserves. And then in Chile, Chile has one of the largest copper reserves in the world. And that was one of the main reasons for the coup, the famous CIA coup against Salvador Allende in 1973, the first 9/11, if you will. And that was partially not only because Allende was a democratically elected socialist and there was a threat of a good example, but also because Allende nationalized the copper in what he called the second independence, the first independence being independence from Spanish colonialism. He called the nationalization of the copper the second independence, and the Anaconda Copper Mining Company was directly affected, and they were one of the main forces in helping the CIA organize the coup. And then finally, the more recent coup in Bolivia in 2019 against Evo Morales, a democratically elected socialist and indigenous president. In Bolivia, they have some of the largest lithium reserves in the world, and lithium is needed for renewable batteries to create phones and computers and electric cars and other technologies. So yeah, I mean, natural resources, of course, are a huge part of it. Labor is another huge part of it. So installing compliant right-wing regimes that will destroy labor unions and break the back of organized labor and keep wages low. We know, for instance, that Hillary Clinton herself, when she was Secretary of State, helped lobby in Haiti to keep the minimum wage from increasing by like 16 cents, keeping it at like 30 cents an hour or something. So we know that cheap labor for foreign corporations to exploit is another factor. And then what I mentioned in terms of the canal is also geopolitics, right? So the Panama Canal ended up being constructed after the US basically created Panama by slicing off part of Colombia in order to create the canal. Panama was basically a US colony and it still barely has political sovereignty. But there were other plans before that of building a canal. And I mentioned, Nicaragua is right in the middle of Central America. It's very geostrategically located. So the U.S. had made plans. I mentioned Cornelius Vanderbilt. There have been many plans going back 200 years to try to build a canal so you could send trade through. You can send ships to send trade from South America to North America, from North America to Asia, to the Pacific region, from South America over to Europe, and you could send those ships through the canal. And the Panama Canal right now has a monopoly. And that was actually one of the reasons why the U.S. actually invaded and overthrew the Panamanian government of Noriega, who had ironically been a longtime CIA asset, a longtime CIA agent, basically, and a drug dealer who was working with the CIA to fund the Contra death squads in Nicaragua in the 1980s. But he outlived his usefulness, and also specifically, the U.S. government invaded and overthrew his government and killed thousands of Panamanians, because that was right when the Panama Canal was going to go back toward, the ownership was going to go to the Panamanian government. So coincidentally, right at the moment when the Panama Canal was going back to be controlled by the Panamanian government, the U.S. government invaded and overthrew Panama's government. So, I mean, all of those factors are interlocking. So it's not just one factor, but natural resources, geostrategic location, exploiting labor, and removing governments that are the threat of a good example, removing socialist governments that could show the world that, yeah, you can create a different kind of model for your society. You can have free healthcare and education and housing and jobs programs and all of these programs like Cuba has provided. And we often we hear propaganda comparing apples to oranges, like comparing Cuba to New York or California or Florida, like these states in the richest country on earth that became rich through pillage, through war, through exploitation. But the real comparison is compare Cuba to the Dominican Republic. And when you see the comparison in metrics when it comes to infant mortality in Cuba, which is higher than infant mortality in the U.S. is higher than in Cuba. The living standards, that is life expectancy. I mean, life expectancy in Cuba is slightly higher than in the U.S. The health outcomes in Cuba are higher than in the U.S. And this is a very poor country, so you have to be able to compare apples to apples. And if you compare Cuba to the Dominican Republic or Haiti, you see what the U.S. actually wants in the region. And Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela and Bolivia, being socialist governments with free healthcare and education and all these programs, are, aside from just their natural resources and all of that, they're also the threat of a good example.
Right. Yeah. So, what is it about this particular election that was so? Um, I don't know if special is the right word to use about it, but I don't remember, in my lifetime, in 33 years of living, that Nicaragua has been in the spotlight of corporate media. Like, I don't remember CNN talking about Nicaragua or Venezuela as much as we've heard in the last couple of years. So what was it about this particular election that made it stand out, that the corporate media now had to talk about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, we're a pretty similar age, so we don't remember in the 1980s when the CIA armed and trained the Contras. The
Right.
in Contra, by the way, this is not that well known. People have heard of the Contras often in the Reagan administration, but they don't know what Contra is short for. Contra is against in Spanish, and the long word is contra revolucionario. That is contra, counter, revolucionario,
Mm.
revolutionary. Counter revolutionary is what it means. The Contras literally were the counter revolutionaries, armed and trained by the CIA, who massacred civilians, burned down schools and hospitals, and did all these horrible things in order to terrorize the Nicaraguan population to turn against the revolutionary Sandinista government. So I mentioned the long history of U.S. meddling in Nicaragua going back to the 1800s. Well, fast forwarding, the U.S. government has on 3 occasions militarily invaded and militarily occupied Nicaragua. And in the 1920s and 30s, there was a military, not a never-ending U.S. military occupation of Nicaragua, like the ongoing U.S. military occupation of Syria and Iraq. So in the 1920s and 30s, a Nicaraguan general created a guerrilla army. His name was Sandino, Augusto Sandino. And Sandino successfully, with this ragtag guerrilla army, which was not only of Nicaraguans, it was revolutionaries from across Latin America flocked to Nicaragua to fight against the U.S. military occupiers,
No
and they
kidding.
won. They successfully expelled the U.S. military in 1933 and 1934, and then Sandino was murdered he was betrayed and murdered by this military dictator, this general, who created a civil guard, and his name was Somoza, Anastasio Somoza. And Somoza then governed. He betrayed. He signed a fake peace agreement with Somoza, and at U.S. orders, he betrayed and murdered Somoza. And a lesson that the indigenous peoples in the U.S. learn: never sign an agreement with the U.S. because they'll never honor it. We still see that today with the Iran nuclear deal. And so, anyway,
Right.
and then in the 1930s, that was the beginning of the Somoza regime. And from 1934, roughly, until 1979, for over 40 years, there was a brutal right wing military dictatorship in Nicaragua run by the Somoza family. And of course, they allowed North American corporations to exploit Nicaragua while they enriched themselves and their families, and the vast majority of Nicaraguans lived in poverty and exploitation. And so in the 1960s, there were a series of revolutionary armed movements inspired by the Cuban Revolution that triumphed in 1959. And revolutionaries created the Sandinista National Liberation Front. And in 1979, after years of struggle, they successfully overthrew, with armed struggle, the U.S. puppet right-wing dictatorship of Somoza in July 1979. And then they declared the revolution to be socialist and implemented progressive policies like a mass program of literacy. I know, a crazy communist policy teaching people how to read, right? So they sent people out to the countryside to teach people how to read, and they had education programs and healthcare and job training and all these programs. And to the U.S. oligarchy, that's a major threat, especially in a very poor country like Nicaragua. So the CIA began arming and training the Contras, and they had a terrorist war in the 1980s, and tens of thousands of Nicaraguans were killed. And then the U.S. imposed a blockade in Nicaragua to suffocate the economy, like the ongoing 60-year blockade of Cuba and the current ongoing blockade of Venezuela that has been going on for a few years. So in the 1980s, there was this terrorist war and the U.S. government blockade. And in 1984, the 84-85, the Nicaraguans had an election, and the Sandinista National Liberation Front won. and President Daniel Ortega won the election fair and square. And the U.S. continued the terrorist war. And after 10 years of that terrorist war in 1990, in another election, the Nicaraguan people were really tired. They didn't want more war. They didn't want more sanctions and blockade and inflation and lack of goods and all those problems. So they voted for the U.S. backed opposition, which basically, I mean, the U.S. had its gun to the collective head of the Nicaraguan people, saying, if you don't vote for our puppet, our right-wing elite multimillionaire oligarch puppets who are going to serve corporate interests and privatize everything and do all of that, then we're going to continue this terrorist war. So in 1990, people were tired and they voted out the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas agreed to step down. The first time in history, a revolutionary movement that took power by arms agreed to step down in a democratic election. And then the right-wing oligarchy, led by the Chamorro oligarchs, the richest, most powerful family in the country, they took over. They privatized the health and education. They sold off the railroads. I mean, they sold the country to foreign corporations, and poverty skyrocketed, violence and crime skyrocketed. It was horrible. And there were neoliberal governments, right-wing governments, from 1990 until 2007. But what happened is the Sandinistas, they reorganized. They organized in working class communities. They built up their forces. They built up the party. They began winning local elections. And in 2006, they won the national elections, the presidential elections, and Daniel Ortega returned to power. And of course, immediately, I mean, even before the election, we know that the U.S. ambassador, this is at the time of the Bush administration, although this is very much bipartisan policy, but the Bush administration basically bribed the Nicaraguan people, offering $100 million in U.S. investment if they refused to vote for the Sandinistas, and the people were not going to fall for that a second time. The Sandinistas won. And then immediately the U.S., we have cables from WikiLeaks, U.S. State Department cables, showing that the U.S. government immediately began working with the right-wing opposition forces to destabilize the Sandinista government and prevent them from governing and all of this. And they were not able to. And the Sandinistas continued growing in popularity, and they won the subsequent elections. Now, what has changed since then? I mean, the U.S. has always been against the Sandinistas, obviously, since they came back to power in 2007. But what changed is that when the Sandinistas came back in 2007, they kind of rebranded a little bit. They dropped some of the more like very explicitly revolutionary anti-imperialist rhetoric, even though they had an anti-imperialist foreign policy, but they tried to kind of like lie low and not to like poke the bear of the U.S. empire, right? So they kind of lay low for a bit, and they were closely allied with Cuba and Venezuela of the Bolivarian Revolution of Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales in Bolivia, and were part of the new revolutionary and progressive movement of governments in Latin America. They were part of the Bolivarian Alliance, the ALBA, which is an economic alliance of left-wing governments in Latin America. And they were part of all of these things. And they continued to win elections. And by 2018, the U.S. was really tired. It was 10 years of the Sandinistas in power, and they tried a violent coup attempt in 2018. So this is when things really drastically shifted. The U.S. for many years, was funding and training right-wing opposition forces. We have documents showing this. Millions of dollars were spent funding and training opposition forces. But then in 2018, the U.S. was really tired of all its past attempts to destabilize the Sandinistas failing, so they launched a violent coup attempt, which was basically, it was the blueprint for the coup against Evo Morales a year later in Bolivia in 2019. And that coup is much more well known because it succeeded, right? And because it succeeded, people now know how brutal it was overthrowing Evo Morales. Well, it failed in 2018 in Nicaragua, but for months, there are these violent far-right fascist gangs, very similar to the Contras, who were burning down the homes of Sandinistas, torturing and killing Sandinistas, kidnapping Sandinistas, attacking state security forces. And then you have this propaganda war emerges. And all the Western corporate media claims the Ortega regime. Note how they never call Saudi Arabia a regime, which never has elections. But Ortega was elected, but they call it Ortega regime. Anyway, So
A little oligarchy is what we're gonna ally ourselves with, but democratically elected leaders, just because they're socialists, they're a regime now.
yeah, I mean, it's absurd. So it's like that meme with the guy from Family Guy, and it's like the color of like the cop has like the color of your skin, and it's like, but instead it's like the more of of U.S. ally you are. So if you're
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia or you're the UAE, like absolute monarchies with no elections, you're fine. You're not a regime. But if you're Nicaragua or Venezuela, if you have democratically elected leaders, you're still your regime. So anyway, so there was all this propaganda claiming that the Ortega regime is killing peaceful protesters. They were not peaceful protesters. I mean, there were protests, but there were also violent elements. So that's how this propaganda works, right? Is that you do have some protests, but then at the same time, you also have these contra style elements that was very similar to how the war in Syria started in 2011, right? You have a mix of protests sometimes, and then these violent forces that are armed and shooting state security and trying to start a civil war. And in 2018, they killed hundreds of Sandinistas. In fact, of the roughly 300, around 300 people killed in the violence in Nicaragua, a plurality were Sandinistas and state security forces. I mean, there are some people we don't know their identity, but of the identified deaths of the opposition right-wing supporters and on the other side, the Sandinistas and the state security, there were more Sandinistas and state security forces killed. But if you read the corporate media propaganda, they act as though Ortega personally went out in the streets and like shot people in the head for protesting. I mean, it's insane propaganda.
But
And they
this
blame
is
all
what they
deaths
said
on the
was
government.
happening in this so I apologize for interrupting, but this is what they're saying was happening in this election as well, right? That Ortega was being violent, and he was calling for the death of the oppositions and all of that sort of stuff.
Not quite. So
Okay.
that was in 2018, and the coup attempt failed. And in July 2018, on July 19th, which is the anniversary of the revolution, every July 19th, well, until COVID, every year there was like a massive rally. And I went for the 40th anniversary in July 2019, and there were over 1 million people gathered in the center of the capital, Managua, to celebrate the anniversary of the revolution. Keep in mind, there are only 6.5 million people in Nicaragua. So we're
Mm.
talking about like 1/6 of the population gathered in the capital to celebrate the revolution. I mean, it's very popular. So because I mean it's not surprising to see why the revolution is popular, because it brought people free healthcare, free education, jobs programs, housing programs, safety and security in a very turbulent, violent region, good quality infrastructure. Like these are all the things that the Sandinistas have brought, and people they remember the years of the right-wing dictatorship before 1979, and they especially remember the years of the US-backed right-wing neoliberal regimes from 1990 until 2007, and they don't want to go back to that. So anyway, the point is that the coup attempt failed in 2018. In July 19th in 2018, there was a huge rally honoring celebrating the revolution. That was the end of the coup. It was clear to everyone that the coup had failed, that people were tired of the violence. Ironically, the coup actually in some ways strengthened the government, because before there were some people who were kind of on the fence and they were forced to pick a side, right? And the right-wing opposition was so extreme and so violent and so fascistic that a lot of people who were on the fence became Sandinistas. So fast forwarding, that was in 2018. Well, this past election was the first election after the failed coup attempt. So
Okay.
that explains why there's been so much propaganda. And after the coup attempt failed in 2018, the US turned to its tactics that it has used against many countries. So the Congress passed sanctions, and specifically Congress passed this legislation called the NICA Act. And I often, joke that the people who wrote this in Congress are not very smart, because the NICA Act, it actually, the A in NICA, it's NICA, already stands for act. So it's like the NIC Act. But that's what you get when you have like these like right-wing Miami, like Marco Rubio types who are just extremely stupid, and they write legislation. They write the NIC Act. But anyway, so in late 2018, the Congress passed the NICA Act, and Trump signed it into law, of course. And that was the first round of sanctions. And then ever since then, every month or two, the U.S. imposes more sanctions, more sanctions, more sanctions. It's very
What?
similar. I mean, it's what the U.S. did to Venezuela, right? So
What a shock.
in 2015, the Obama administration declared Venezuela this is an exact quote, an extraordinary and unusual threat to the national security of the United States. And that was used to justify imposing sanctions. And every year, the US government under Obama, Trump, and now Biden, every year the US government renews this executive order declaring Venezuela and now Nicaragua an extraordinary and unusual threat to the national security of the United States. The Biden administration has already done it because it's been in power for about a year now. So the Biden administration continued imposing these sanctions when it came in, and then the election came up this November. Now, we can talk about the election, but the narrative about the election was not necessarily of any violence because this is a very peaceful country. I mean, I'm here right now. I mean, I feel safer in Nicaragua than in some parts of the U.S. Like the murder rate in Nicaragua is lower than the murder rate in the U.S. And especially it's lower than like in big cities than in the U.S. Violent crime is very low in Nicaragua, especially compared to its neighbors like El Salvador and Honduras, which have some of the highest murder rates on earth, are extremely violent countries and have right-wing U.S.-backed regimes. Well, until now, I mean, Honduras has just had another election too, which we can talk about, with
Right.
which the left won. So, surprise, surprise, the countries in Central America with the most corrupt right-wing U.S.-friendly regimes are the most violent countries in the region.
Do you feel like that's the reduction in violence comes from the fact that you have a government that wants to, I don't know, take care of its people by providing them with healthcare and housing and food programs? Do you feel like that's kind of linked? Like,
No, exactly. I mean, surprise, surprise. If you have a country that invests in the people and in social programs, you're going to have more stability, less violence, more peace. So it's no surprise in any sense there. But the main element is because there's very little to no, I mean, there's very little organized crime because that's where the violence comes from, right? So in El Salvador and Honduras, there are entire parts of cities, entire neighborhoods that are controlled by gangs. And even police know not to enter certain areas, right? And I mean, it's kind of similar to this strategy where, like, you know, there are people in parts of Chicago who say that like the police intentionally encourage gang violence to basically just like to keep the population like under control and to like also just like kill off poor people, and like police like allow gangs to kind of operate. And there's a lot of corruption. I mean, in the U.S. government, although the U.S. never calls it corruption, but that's corruption in the U.S. government in like Chicago and New York and a lot of these places. And
oh
in
yeah.
El Salvador and Honduras, it's similar, right? Like you have police forces that are like sometimes part of gangs and, you know, working with gangs and all of this. So unlike in the U.S., the gangs just have badges and they're called cops. So I mean, I guess there's, but in Honduras and El Salvador, you mean like the Maras and MS-13 and all these groups. I mean, Trump exaggerated. They're not very influential in the U.S., but in El Salvador, I mean, they really are. They have a lot of influence. They kill a lot of people. They have a lot of money. They deal drugs and they sell a lot of drugs and make a lot of money. In Honduras, that's the same story. Ever since a 2009 coup, surprise, surprise, there was a progressive, democratically elected government. And in 2009, the U.S. government backed a coup to overthrow it, the president Manuel Zelaya in Honduras. And since then, the government has been taken over by drug dealers and right-wing oligarchs, and none of that exists in Nicaragua. I mean, it's the police are a nationalist police that were created by the Sandinistas, and they really crack down hard on organized crime. So if you don't have drug trafficking and gangs and all of that, you have very little violence. So I mean, there is some crime. There's crime in every country on earth, right? But like compared to its neighbors, it's night and day. And it's because the government takes proactive policies to provide opportunities and jobs and education to poor people, so they don't have to like go down the route of selling drugs, because instead of working like some horrible job where they're exploited and get their wages stolen from them. So that's a huge part of it. And then the other part of it is that they don't tolerate organized crime, and there's not nearly as much corruption.
So you're telling me The Sopranos not big in Nicaragua? They're not. Ratings are going down. So why is there so much propaganda that there's, because that was one of the things that I remember hearing, if I bring up, oh, that they're, a democratically elected leader, Daniel Ortega is a democratically elected leader, there's people that'll claim, well, that's because he kills the opposition. Why is that the narrative? Is that going back to just the fact that we're sticking to the 2018 failed coup and we're just going to keep kind of rehashing bullshit from that, or is this something new that they're trying?
Yeah, good question. I'll say there's two kind of main narratives, and I'll pick them apart that people use to try to delegitimize the government. One, to be fair, honestly, people don't even claim that the government kills the opposition. It doesn't. I mean, again, it's a very peaceful country. There are very few deaths. So what they claim is, one, that the opposition is not allowed to participate in the political process, and that the government just arrests all the opposition. Now, that's
Mm.
extremely misleading. I mean, it's false. There's, like with any myth, there's maybe like a 5% grain of truth that is exaggerated, but it's false. I mean, I'll explain that in a second. And then the other narrative that's used to try to delegitimize the government is because Ortega, I mean, this is his fourth term. So this is similar to the narrative used against Evo Morales. And I'll start with this first because it's the easier one to respond to. So, all right. Yeah, okay, it's Ortega's fourth term. He's a very popular leader. Polls consistently show that he has 60 to 70% support. So, I mean, there's no term limits and he keeps winning elections. So you could say that whatever, I guess you could say it's undemocratic, but you can also say it's undemocratic if you have a very popular leader. You could say it's undemocratic if that leader can't come back to power, especially if you don't have a history of better alternatives, right? So let's not forget what's going on right now in Brazil. In Brazil, Lula da Silva, the left-wing president, he left office after 2 terms and was the most popular leader probably in world history. When he left office, he had almost 90% approval, which is insane. It's staggering. I mean, insane. And
Wow.
what happened after is his successor, Dilma Rousseff, was overthrown in a kind of soft coup, a judicial coup, backed by the FBI and the Justice Department and the Obama and then Trump administrations, which carried out this soft, like, lawfare. That's like legal warfare, a soft coup. They they impeached Dilma Rousseff, the elected president. They installed this right-wing neoliberal Michel Temer, who privatized everything, and then finally they imprisoned Lula da Silva in 2018 to prevent him from running for president because he was leading in all the polls by double digits. So because he was imprisoned, the far-right fascist candidate Jair Bolsonaro, who was very unpopular, but he was more well-known than the other candidate who replaced Lula, who was not very well-known, Haddad, Bolsonaro won, and it was a totally rigged election. I mean, because if you imprison the most popular candidate, that's not a fair election. So they imprisoned Lula, and Bolsonaro came to power, and the U.S. totally supported that bipartisan. Brazil is being invited to Biden's fake summit for democracy after doing that. So, like, this is totally bipartisan. So anyway, the point is that now there's an upcoming election next year in 2022 in Brazil, and Lula da Silva is the candidate, and people want him to come back to power for his third term, and he might even do a fourth term. So the point of what I'm getting at is that, look, like, if people really like a president, it's not undemocratic if they keep voting that president again. And this is what happened in Bolivia with Evo Morales. Evo Morales was going for his fourth term, which he won freely and fairly in the election. And then there was a U.S.-backed coup against him. And that was one of the main propaganda talking points, was that he's a dictator or he's authoritarian because he's staying in for his fourth term, even though he was democratically elected. But Angela Merkel, today is December 8th. Angela Merkel just stepped down today after over 16 years in office. Longer than Ortega, longer than Xi Jinping in China, longer than Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, longer than Evo Morales was in power. But Angela Merkel, because she's from Germany, a Western imperialist ally, she's a member of NATO and the EU, she's not called authoritarian, unlike Evo Morales, unlike Daniel Ortega. So, I mean, it's propaganda. So I'll talk about the other point here, a more sophisticated, but again, false talking point. Then there's a talking point that the Nicaraguan government supposedly doesn't allow the opposition to participate in the elections. Totally false. I did some reports at the Grayzone. That's thegrayzone.com, gray with an A. And there in my reports, you can find, I also did a video there. You can find photos of the ballots on the November 7th elections. There were 7 different choices on the ballots, and 6 of those choices were the right-wing opposition. And that was in the Caribbean coast, which has political autonomy. And then in the national ballot, there were 6 options, 5 of which were the right-wing opposition. And including in the presidential election, there were 6 options on the ballot. Daniel Ortega was only one of the candidates. There were other candidates that were on the ballot. So it's totally false that the opposition is not allowed to participate. In fact, still right now, I mean, I live here. I was out driving yesterday, and yesterday, still like on the street, you go down the street and you see tons of signs and banners and posters for opposition parties that were campaigning in the elections. So they have like the Liberal Party and this party, like the Alliance for the Republic, APRE, and all these parties. Like you still see their materials campaigning. Like you still see it out in public. Still, like weeks after the election. I mean, they were out before the election too, obviously. But the point is that the idea that the opposition can't participate is absurd propaganda. So then this is the other part of the talking point, that they claim, the right-wing opposition and the corporate media propaganda claims that the government imprisoned the presidential hopefuls. And we should use that term with a huge like mountain of salt there, because basically what that means is that if you violate the law, if you launder money by taking millions of dollars from the US government to try to organize a violent coup attempt, and then you're imprisoned for violating the law, then all you have to do is say, I wanted to be president, right? Like, I would love to be president. I'm a presidential hopeful, and I'm a political prisoner, and I need to be released. And that's exactly what happened in Nicaragua. There were right-wing, multimillionaire oligarch elites who violated the law by taking millions of dollars from the U.S. government. We have documents showing this. It's a matter of public record. The U.S. doesn't even deny that because they know it's true, but they say that they're political prisoners and they're being imprisoned for their political views. No, they're being imprisoned for violating laws on money laundering, violating laws on foreign agents registration, and violating a very controversial law. You can't organize a violent coup attempt to overthrow the government. Very controversial. I know that in every other country in the world, you're allowed to organize a violent coup, but in Nicaragua, they have very crazy laws where you can't do that. So there were these forces behind the coup attempts who were imprisoned, and because they're backed by the U.S. claims they're political prisoners. Now, very quick story here. The U.S. funds these groups in Nicaragua through there's two main arms. One is called the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, which is basically a CIA cutout created by the Ronald Reagan administration's CIA in the 1980s. They were used to fund the Contras in the 1980s. They were used to do a lot of CIA operations. And they continue funding a lot of right-wing opposition groups across Latin America, especially in Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba. There's also the USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which claims to be a humanitarian organization, but has been involved in many violent coup attempts. USAID sent weapons to the Contras on so-called humanitarian flights in the 1980s, which again is a sign of what the U.S. when the U.S. says, "Hey, we have some humanitarian aid for you," what they actually mean is we have a bunch of guns hidden like under some band-aids. So, and anyway, so USAID and the NED have spent tens of millions of dollars funding these right-wing opposition groups and the people behind the coup in Nicaragua. And they did this through a series of right-wing oligarchs, like I mentioned, the Chamorro family and all of that. And I did a story we published at the Grayzone. One of the men who was involved in the coup, who was imprisoned for having explosives, which, again, controversial law. You can't just walk around with explosives in Nicaragua. And this guy, during the coup, who was imprisoned, he was later released because he was put on a list of so-called political prisoners, in scare quotes. And this list of political prisoners came from 2 different groups, both funded by the U.S. government and by the Spanish government, by the way, which plays a similar role to the U.S., the old colonizer and the new colonizer working together. So in these groups that advocate for so-called political prisoners, they publish these lists of hundreds of people they claim were political prisoners. And most of them, I mean, pretty much all of them were violent criminals, the majority of them. And one of them, as an example, was this guy who had the explosives. He was in prison. Then the government agreed to peace talks brokered by the U.S. government and the Catholic Church, which played an important role backing the right-wing opposition during the coup. And in the negotiations, the government agreed to release so-called political prisoners, and it released some of these people. This guy who was the violent criminal who had the explosives during the coup attempt, he then, a few months later, he stabbed his pregnant girlfriend to death with a screwdriver. Again, this is his girlfriend, and she was pregnant with his child, and he stabbed her to death, and then he was imprisoned. So these are the kinds of people that are listed as so-called political prisoners. What it means is really anyone who's imprisoned by the Sandinista government. There was another case of this guy who was involved in the coup. He was imprisoned, and then he was released as part of the U.S. and OAS and an EU brokered amnesty negotiation process. And the guy who was released in amnesty, this other guy, he was then later imprisoned because he and another guy were caught with guns and explosives and were planning to blow up Sandinista mayor's offices in this town of Masaya. So, like, I mean, when the U.S. claims someone as a political prisoner, what they mean is like, damn it, our employee has been in prison. We got to get them out.
It sounds like a real backwards country there, Ben. You know, you can't you could start a coup. You can't imprison people that are stabbing girlfriends. Sounds like a real backwards place. I don't know how you stand it.
You can't walk around with explosives. You can't plan to blow up government buildings. It's a real dictatorship. I want my freedom.
Freedom.
Freedom prize.
Where's the freedom down there? And you said 6 to 7 political parties. That's ridiculous. Everybody knows you have 2 political parties in a democracy, and that's it. That's all
and they're
you're allowed.
indistinguishable from each other.
Right. One party says kind of nice things, and that's about it. But they both legislate exactly the same. You can't have very different political parties now? That's ridiculous. That's crazy. This is the thing is like that's also whenever people are talking about Venezuela, I think there was like a video that Popular Resistance put out of people going in and like what poll stations look like, and they use paper ballots that they cross check with the voting booths and everything, and it's hilarious that America has anything to say about any other country's election system when our election system here is just a massive dumpster fire. So and even you have international election observers that go down there and say this is a fair and legitimate election, but you have the OAS that claims that this is not. Just so folks kind of know what the OAS is. What is the OAS? Where does it come from? And Nicaragua is leaving the OAS, right? They no longer see that as any sort of authority on elections. Why are they leaving the OAS?
The OAS stands for Organization of American States. And what is it? It's Washington. I mean, it's Washington in drag, right? Like it's Uncle Sam in drag. So the OAS was created in 1948, right at the beginning of the first Cold War. And I say first because we're kind of now in a new Cold War, right? So at the beginning of the first Cold War, the U.S. government convened a group of right-wing regimes in Latin America that were all anti-communist, anti-socialist, and they convened in Colombia, which is, the heart of U.S. imperialism in Latin America, this narco regime. It's basically a U.S. colony. And they got together and created this alliance. And some of the founding members included the right-wing Somoza dictatorship, the military general dictatorship here in Nicaragua was one of the founding members of the OAS. So, they have a lot of authority when it comes to elections, right? They were founded by military dictatorships who didn't even have elections. So anyway, they were founded in 1948 as a coalition of right-wing governments. And basically that's still the same role they play, although they've kind of rebranded a little bit. And so in 1962, the OAS expelled Cuba Cuba had its revolution in 1959. At first, it was like a left-wing nationalist revolution. It was not explicitly socialist, but then Fidel Castro declared it a Marxist-Leninist revolution. He declared himself a communist and allied the Soviet Union. But of course, he did that after the U.S. Tried to invade the country and impose sanctions and the blockade in the country. So it was actually an example of the U.S. kind of radicalizing the revolution further in Cuba. It was just it's a historical lesson. I mean, so anyway, I mean, it's something that happened in Venezuela with the 2002 U.S. coup against Hugo Chavez, which was briefly successful, but Chavez was so popular that the people in Venezuela filled the streets and demanded that their democratically elected president come back, and he did. And after that, Chavez became a major thorn in the side of U.S. imperialism. He began criticizing the U.S. openly, and later declared himself a socialist. So
Didn't
we see a
didn't
history of
didn't
this.
didn't Chavez say that where George Bush stood, he could smell sulfur? That was like the big famous thing that he said, and I was like, man, you nailed it. That's probably what he smells like.
So yeah, at the United Nations General Assembly, Bush spoke, and then after Bush spoke, Chavez went up on stage, and he's like, "Yeah, it smells like sulfur." And then he said, "George Bush is literally the devil," is what he said, and he was holding this book, "The Open Veins of Latin America," which is a brilliant kind of history of colonialism in Latin America. So
It's
anyway,
amazing.
going to the election and um, Venezuela. I was talking. Oh yeah, talking about the OAS. Excuse me. So in the OAS, so Cuba was expelled in 1962, and then the OAS continued being the same. But what happened is after the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc and the end of the First Cold War, then the U.S. began rebranding and said, "Oh, we're a democracy promotion," and we Francis Fukuyama, this like fraud of a fake philosopher. It's like a level D or F philosopher. He claimed the end of history, like neoliberal democracy was the capitalist democracy is the end of history, and every country in the world is going to adopt the U.S. model and all this nonsense. So then the U.S. began trying to turn like the OAS into something for so-called democracy promotion. And before that, I mean, again, there were military dictatorships who were involved in the OAS. They didn't even pretend otherwise. But then in the early 2000s, you have the rise of leftist governments in Latin America. Hugo Chavez wins his first election in Venezuela in 1998. Lula da Silva comes to power in the 1990s. And then in the 2000s, you have Rafael Correa in Ecuador. You have Evo Morales in Bolivia. You have Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. You have Fernando Lugo in Paraguay. So most of and I mentioned Memo Zelaya in Honduras. So you have the Kirchners in Argentina. So you have progressive left-leaning governments in most of Latin America. And the U.S. really starts trying to destabilize those governments, and the OAS plays a key role in that. The OAS played a role in legitimizing the 2009 U.S.-backed right-wing military coup in Honduras, in legitimizing the 2012 soft coup against Lugo in Paraguay, in legitimizing the 2016 soft coup against the elected president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. And then the OAS starts taking action against Venezuela. Venezuela in 2019 leaves the OAS, and then in response, the OAS recognizes puppet Juan Guaido as fake president of Venezuela. So Guaido, who controls nothing, who, by the way, has never been elected president. He's never received a single vote to be fake president. So the U.S. claims that he's democratic. I mean, Maduro has won millions of votes in multiple presidential elections. Guaido has never participated in a presidential election. His party, the right-wing Leni Riefenstahl sounding Voluntad Popular, Popular Will Party, they participated in the last election this November, and they were crushed. It was not a presidential election. It was a regional election. They were crushed. But, he's democratic according to the U.S.
We all love an underdog story, right?
Exactly. So the OAS recognizes Guaido. And then finally, the OAS in 2019, this was an eye-opening moment for a lot of people. The OAS, after recognizing Juan Guaido as fake president of Venezuela, they play a key role in the coup in Bolivia. The OAS spreads fake news, propaganda claiming that Evo Morales stole the election and that there was electoral fraud. Totally fake. And mainstream experts at MIT and at this really good think tank in DC, probably the only good think tank in DC, called the Center for Economic and Policy Research, they published studies showing that the OAS claims of electoral fraud were totally false, according to their own report. And the OAS just made this lie up to justify a U.S.-backed far-right coup in Bolivia, overthrowing the elected president, Evo Morales, and installing a right-wing dictatorship, which the U.S. claimed was democratic. So, again, lesson here. If you are a leftist who are elected, you're a regime. If you're a right-wing dictatorship, you're a democratic government, according to the U.S. and according to the OAS. Also, I should have said earlier, the majority of the OAS's budget comes from the U.S., and where is the OAS located? It is located in Washington, a few blocks from the White House and a few blocks from the State Department. The OAS is the United States, and that's why Fidel Castro, the Cuban government, famously referred to the OAS as the Ministry of the Yankee Colonies. And that is why Nicaragua agreed. That's why it announced in November that it is leaving the OAS.
That makes sense. It seems like a good move. I feel like that's the right move for them to make. I have one more question for you, and this might be kind of a big question because a lot of this stuff surrounds kind of the state of propaganda. Okay, and people, and I agree with this statement. Everybody says Americans are the most propagandized people on the planet, which is true. You can't run a capitalist country like this without the level of propaganda that exists here. What do you say to people that want to counter that? How do you think people that know this information or that listen to this interview or read the Grayzone, what is the best way of communicating to kind of break through some of the propaganda that we hear about socialist governments and about anything that just kind of pushes back against capitalism itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, we just have to think about what democracy means. I mean, to sound like a college freshman essay, like Webster's dictionary definition of democracy is ruled by the people. But like, seriously, if democracy is supposed to mean a government that represents the people, I mean, obviously the U.S. does not have a democracy in any single way, in no way whatsoever. Not only because, I mean, we've had multiple presidents in recent years who lost the popular vote, and in the case of 2000, didn't even win the real vote. I mean, it was just blatantly stole by Bush, and that went down it was flushed down the memory hole. And now like Democrats are saying how cute George Bush and his paintings of his like demonic, like the ghosts of his victims are. Like, so they even forget about that. But of course, then there's also the fact that aside from massive electoral problems in the U.S. system, no paper ballots, the clear rigging of the Democratic primary against Bernie Sanders, both times, not just the first time, but both times, and like the insane primary system and super delegates and voter disenfranchisement and gerrymandering. Aside from all of that, the insane problems with the fake democracy in the U.S., there's also just the fact that even if there weren't all those problems and the U.S. system were actually more representative, I mean, the people who are voted in still don't actually serve the interests of the people. They serve the interests of large corporations. So in the U.S., what we have is every 4 or 8 years, the faces change, but the policies never change. Whereas in places like Nicaragua and Venezuela and Bolivia, the faces might not change as much, but the policies do change. And people, at the end of the day, surprise, surprise, people care much more about the policies than the faces, right? Like in the U.S., politics is like a sport. It's like you're supposed to watch it like a football game, and you have no influence over the outcome. Just as like if you're cheering for like the Cowboys and the Packers or whatever in a football game, like you cheering them on and praying has no outcome, has no impact on that game. And that's basically how U.S. politics is. It's a sport that you can watch from the sidelines and you can learn all about it. But when it comes to actual electoral politics, you have no influence on it, because regardless of whether or not your team wins, the policies never change because you're not the actual constituency. The constituency are Wall Street, Silicon Valley, shareholders, billionaires, the top 5%, so the US is not a democracy. So what kind of, and then even aside from that, I mean, just looking at the Iowa and New Hampshire caucuses, like in the last Democratic primary, like the US has no right whatsoever to lecture any country on earth about democracy. I mean, come on. Like, it's absolutely absurd. And then finally, the last thing I'll say in terms of the corporate media propaganda, it's like, how many times does the corporate media need to lie to us? It's not just WMDs. It's frankly easy. It's babies in incubators. The claim that the Iraqi army was taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators, totally lie, total false. The claim that in 2011 that Muammar Gaddafi in Libya was giving his soldiers Viagra to rape women, totally false. Totally false. And Hillary Clinton claimed that, totally false. Or the lie of the Gulf of Tonkin, in which the U.S. started a war of aggression in Vietnam and then used it to try to claim that it was defending itself. Or the secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos, which the media also sold lies about. Or the Russiagate nonsense, that Trump is this Russian asset and all of that nonsense. And the P-tape, we now know that like the Steele dossier was totally fake. I mean, how many times is the corporate media going to lie to us about? Or here's another one recently, that Russia was paying the Taliban to kill U.S. soldiers, as if the Taliban that had been fighting the U.S. for 20 years needed extra money to be motivated to fight the U.S. military occupiers. That story was also proven a few months later to be totally false. Like, how many times are people just going to go along with the corporate media with all these lies, especially on international coverage? Because people will say to me sometimes, oh, well, Ben, not everything in the corporate media is a lie. Yeah, I agree. Not everything. I'll go further. Maybe like 50, 60, even maybe 70% of what they say is true. But 30% or whatever is not true, and especially foreign policy coverage, because that's the stuff where manufacturing consent is the most important. Because in domestic politics, again, there's already this like artificial manufactured consent where you don't even have a choice, so it doesn't really matter. The real manufacturing consent is done on war. And we can see that now where slightly over 50% of Americans now support sending U.S. troops to Taiwan. And now a slight majority of Americans support U.S. military involvement in Ukraine. And that's because of the manufacturing consent based on foreign coverage of foreign countries. That's where most of the propaganda is. Like, of course, yeah, most of the articles about like domestic politics and Kristen Sinema and whatever and all the nonsense happening in U.S. politics, yeah, okay, fine. That's probably mostly truthful. But when it comes to official enemies of the U.S. State Department, especially countries with socialist governments, I mean, you cannot trust that corporate media coverage. And we've seen it again and again and again for decades.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you there. And seriously, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. And this was such an incredibly informative conversation. So thank you so much. Where can people find out more about you, your work, and where to follow you?
Yeah, so I am a journalist with the Grayzone. That's the gray with an A zone.com. And I have a podcast called Moderate Rebels, and I do interviews and stuff, and I also just post videos on YouTube and Rockfin as well. Rockfin is a cool platform that doesn't have like as much algorithm censorship as YouTube. So yeah, you can find me and on Twitter at twitter.com/Benjamin Norton. So yeah, you can follow me there. And Chris, thanks for having me, and keep up the good work.
Thanks, man. Yeah, you too. This was fantastic. I appreciate it. Awesome. there you have it, folks. That is our conversation with Grayzone's Ben Norton. Be sure to go and follow Ben on all the social feeds at Benjamin Norton on Twitter, and make sure that you subscribe to the Gray Zone, Gray Zone. Go check them out. I use them as a source, for a lot of the pieces that I put together. Um, yeah, they're an invaluable resource. A lot of great information. In fact, the show that I'm putting together now, uh, uh, the Gray Zone is a central source that I use to debunk one of the imperialist myths about China. So, they're a super important resource. I very much enjoy the work that they're putting out. So, if you enjoyed this conversation, go check out the Gray Zone. Go check out Ben Norton's work. Go check out Max Blumenthal's work and Aaron Mate and everybody that's on Anya Parampil. Like they have an amazing staff of journalists and writers on that site. So that is something that I highly recommend you guys go check out. The Gray Zone, Gray Zone. Follow Ben at Benjamin Norton. The year is winding down, guys. The year is winding down. This is the last interview of the year. It's the last one, and I can't think of anybody better to close out the year than Ben Norton, who is a journalist that I have been following for a number of years now, and was very honored to get to talk to him. And hopefully he'll be back. I'm sure he will. But I also know that he is incredibly busy. Breaking down the narratives of the oligarchy. That's an important job. So I was very honored that he was able to come on and do the podcast here. So this is the last interview. The next 2 weeks, we're dipping into Christmas. We're dipping into the new year, and then we'll be back with interviews relatively consistently into the new year, 2022, with this new schedule that we had. So the last 2 episodes of the year, one of them is going to be a fun surprise stand-up comedy. I don't know if I want to call it like an audio special or something, but it's basically, it is a set that is not released to the public, except when I release it to the public. I guess it's a set that normally would go out to my sustaining members, but because it's Christmas, I want to put this set out for everybody to listen to. So it is going to be a hour to an hour and a half of my stand-up comedy as a fun Christmas gift to you guys. Something that normally would go out to my patrons, to the sustaining members, is going to be available to everybody. So that's fun. That's cool. That's exciting. And then the last episode will be a recap of the year, kind of a reflection, kind of a mental health check-in kind of thing. Because as you guys might know, and maybe you don't, or maybe you don't care. I don't really know, but if you've been paying attention to the stuff that I've been doing, the things that I've been talking about, I went through a bunch of shit this year, a bunch of changes, mostly good changes. But it's always good to kind of look back and see where things started and how they arrived to where they are and where they're going and where you would like things to go. Those are kind of the things that I'm going to kind of talk about, and some of it's going to be for me too, to kind of look back and be like, oh shit, that was kind of a crazy thing that you went through and got through, and so on and so forth. So that's what's coming up in the next couple weeks in the podcast. I've got some interviews lined up that I'm pretty psyched to share with you guys next year. I'll probably have some tour dates to share with you guys next year as well, because I'm going to be working on those. And I've got 2 more shows. If you're listening to this on the day it comes out, or within the first couple days that it comes out, I am going to be performing my last 2 shows of the year. The last virtual show is tomorrow, December 17th. I'm going to be talking about China, breaking down some of the myths, breaking down why America is getting so much more aggressive towards China. and what the propaganda surrounding that country is all about. That's tomorrow, Friday, December 17th at 8 p.m. virtually over Zoom. So you're gonna need a Zoom account in order to come to that show. That's the only kind of restriction there. And then on December 18th, I'm going to be doing my very last show of the year. It is an in person live performance in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at the Fun House at Mr. Smalls. I'm going to be performing my new show, The Citizen Revolution. And I'm pretty excited about it. I'm a little nervous about it. I'm trying to get out of my own head when I'm performing because I've noticed I do that, and when I get into my own head, I lose confidence and I stop having fun on stage, and that whole thing happens. So I'm approaching this with a mindset of let's have fun with what we what we have in front of us, kind of a thing. So that's the last show, Saturday, December 18th in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at the Fun House at Mr. Smalls. Tickets will be available at the door. They're available online as well. So if you guys are in Pittsburgh and want to come out to that, that's happening on Saturday, December 18th. Tickets and all the information are available on my website, krishmohanhaha.com. It's KRISHMOHANHAHA.com. It's a good place to grab my stand-up comedy albums or gift my stand-up comedy albums to someone that might enjoy it because it is the holiday season. You can do that. You can become a sustaining member. You can make a one-time donation. You can do a bunch of different stuff on my website. It is sort of the one-stop shop for all things Krish Mohan. Again, that's KRISHMOHANHAHA.com. It's krishmohanhaha.com. And I hope you guys are having a good holiday season. I know things kind of get hectic, things kind of get crazy. I actually, had to reschedule the two shows from this past week, the DSA fundraiser and my virtual stand-up comedy show, to end of January, early February, because things are just hectic, and people have holiday things to deal with. So I was trying to kind of give a little bit of entertainment thing, but I don't know if anybody's particularly in the mode to sit indoors and watch a virtual show on a weekend. At this point, I think more and more people are starting to get a little antsy and itchy to go out and do stuff. So that's what they're doing, and that's cool. It's fine. That's why I'm kind of switching up a couple things, and I'll talk more about that in the later episode too. But yeah, I hope the holiday season isn't too insane for you guys. I hope that things are going well, and and if it is insane, I hope you guys have a pretty good support system, so that it doesn't have to continue being insane. But with all that said and done, I hope to see some of you guys at the virtual show or at the in-person show this weekend. And if you can't make it this weekend, I hope to see you at a future show. And with all that said and done, be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and stay taboo, everybody. We'll see you next week. Have a good one.